On the morning of September 11th, 2011, in the Harlem neighborhood of New York, life for the Levi family stopped as they knew it. That day had begun like any ordinary day, until that cry tore through the house. Joseph, only 5 years old, was sobbing uncontrollably in his room. David and Miriam rushed in. Their first thought was simple: a bad dream, the kind every parent faces countless times. Miriam wrapped her arms around him. "It's okay. We're here," she whispered softly. But the fear on Joseph's face didn't fade. His eyes were open, yet he seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Then he spoke. "I saw them, nailing him to the wood." His voice trembled. It wasn't the voice of a child. There was something heavier in it, older. David stiffened. "What are you talking about, son?" Joseph kept crying. There was blood everywhere. The stones of Golgotha were covered in blood. The room fell silent. Not a normal silence, a silence that crawls under your skin. David and Miriam exchanged a look. Joseph had never been told the crucifixion in such detail. He had never heard names like Golgotha, not on TV, not in books, not in conversations at home, nowhere. Something broke inside Miriam in that moment. This wasn't a dream. Joseph wouldn't calm down. It was as if the scene was still right in front of his eyes. Then he whispered, "They were so scared." "Who?" David asked gently. "Everyone there. Then the soldiers came." David couldn't speak after that. A 5-year-old child was describing soldiers, the cross, blood-soaked stones, not like someone retelling a story, but like someone remembering a life he had lived. Joseph stayed home that day, but the strangeness didn't stop. That afternoon he picked up a pencil and paper. He didn't draw cars or animals this time. He drew narrow streets, stone pathways, small shops, arched buildings. Miriam couldn't help herself. "Where is this?" she asked. Without lifting his head, Joseph replied, "The marketplace, beside the temple." The calmness in his voice was terrifying. That evening she tried again. "How do you know this?" Joseph shrugged. "I don't know, but I was there." Then he added, "I used to sell olive oil." That night, David and Miriam couldn't sleep. They were both thinking the same thing, yet neither dared to say it aloud. This wasn't a child's imagination. Something very old was awakening. The next day, Joseph was quiet, as if nothing from the previous morning had ever happened. But this silence wasn't peaceful. He had withdrawn into himself. He wasn't playing. He just kept staring out the window. Miriam couldn't take it anymore. She sat beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Joseph didn't answer for a long time. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "My name wasn't Joseph." Miriam smiled, thinking it was a game. "Oh? What was it then?" Joseph lifted his head. His eyes were calm, but deadly serious. "My name was Eliasa ben Shimon." Miriam's blood ran cold. Joseph had never said this name before. They had never heard it in a book, a movie, a conversation at home. Nowhere. David walked into the room. "What are you talking about, son?" Joseph repeated it, with the exact same clarity. "Eliasa ben Shimon. That was me." At that moment, both parents understood. This wasn't a game. From that day on, Joseph's stories became consistent. No confusion, No scattered fantasies, clear and structured, as if he were remembering a story hidden deep in his memory, piece by piece. He described himself as a merchant living in Jerusalem. There was a marketplace near the temple, he said. I used to sell olive oil, spices, and salt. I opened my shop early in the morning. One day, David asked, curious, "Why did you open so early?" Joseph didn't hesitate. People came before the sun got too high, and later the soldiers would fill the streets. No one could shop comfortably then. The soldiers. Every time Joseph said that word, his face tightened. The Romans, he said. They were always harsh. They weighed the money. They questioned everyone. These details were not the thoughts of a child. He spoke like someone who understood the economic and social life of the era. One day, Joseph placed a drawing on the kitchen table. A stone-paved road, shops on both sides. David stared at it for a long moment. "What road is this?" he asked. Joseph traced the drawing with his finger. "This is the main road. Everyone used to walk through here. It was crowded in the mornings." David noticed something. Joseph didn't say, "It is crowded." He said, "It was crowded," past tense. That evening, David and Miriam finally spoke openly. "This isn't normal," David said. "No dream stays this consistent." Miriam began to cry. "What if he's really remembering?" she whispered. "What if he's living a life that doesn't belong to him?" There was no answer to that question, only a growing fear, and Joseph kept talking. One evening after dinner, he suddenly said, "After the crucifixion, everything changed." His parents stopped. "What changed?" Miriam asked. Joseph lowered his head. Fear came. Everywhere. He wasn't just describing the crucifixion anymore. He was describing what came after, days even the Gospels barely mention. "There were no shouts in the streets," he said. "There were whispers and silence. Everyone stayed quiet." David felt his throat tighten. A child, describing one of the darkest days in history, with emotions even an adult would struggle to express. And this was only the beginning. Joseph's stories were no longer scattered scenes. They no longer felt like fragments. They carried the weight of an entire life, a life lived before. It was as if he could still smell the city he remembered, hear its sounds, feel its stones beneath his feet. One evening, while David was giving Joseph some milk, the boy suddenly spoke. "After the crucifixion, the streets were quiet." David froze. "Why?" Joseph took a deep breath. He was uncomfortable speaking about it. Even his voice thinned. "Everyone was afraid. The soldiers were everywhere. When I went to the marketplace, no one talked." Miriam stepped closer. "What were they afraid of?" she asked softly. Joseph lowered his gaze. "They were looking for his friends." David frowned. "Whose friends?" Joseph answered in a whisper. "The one who was crucified." He never said the name Jesus, but every sentence pointed directly to him. A long silence followed. Joseph's voice began to tremble. Sometimes the soldiers came to the market, walking from stall to stall. "Have you seen the Galileans?" they'd ask, and everyone would lower their heads and say no. David asked quietly, "And you? What did you do?" Joseph tightened his little fists. "I lowered my head too, My heart would beat so fast. I felt like they could hear it. These were not the words of a child imagining things. This was fear, the fear of someone who had lived it. There was silence, everywhere in the streets. The next morning, Joseph was drawing during breakfast. A long, narrow stone street, completely empty. Miriam leaned closer. Was this street in Jerusalem too? Joseph nodded. Yes. In the days after the crucifixion, no one walked here. Why not? Because sometimes the soldiers stood in this street and questioned people. In one corner of the page, he had drawn a small shadow. Miriam pointed at it. What is this? Joseph squinted, as if remembering a real scene. One of the soldiers. He used to stand here. A chill ran down Miriam's spine. How many soldiers were there? Joseph answered instantly. 4. One of them carried a wooden stick. How could he possibly know a detail like that? The chaos at the marketplace. That afternoon, Joseph began describing the market. Some days we closed our stalls because the soldiers were searching for someone. People would scream. David looked up sharply. Scream? Yes, Joseph said. When a Roman arrested someone, everyone screamed. But then everyone went silent because they were afraid. His tiny shoulders sank. I was afraid too. David pulled him into his arms. You can think of it like a dream if you want. But Joseph shook his head. No, it's not a dream. I was there. As if that day was coming again. One night, Joseph couldn't sleep. He came into their room. Sometimes I still hear their voices, he said. Whose voices? Miriam asked. The people, the ones crying, and the soldiers' footsteps. Footsteps. Even that small detail was chilling. Because later, when they researched it, they learned that Roman soldiers' sandals echoed loudly on stone streets. Ancient texts mentioned it repeatedly. No 5-year-old could know this. Before Joseph went to bed that night, he said one more thing. Jerusalem was so sad that day. It felt like the city itself was crying. This was not a simple metaphor a child invents. This was emotion, lived, remembered, carried from another time. Joseph's stories remained hidden within the family for a while, but they had become so detailed, so consistent, that David and Miriam realized they could no longer try to understand this on their own. They needed an expert. So they contacted Dr. Amos Klausner, a well-known archaeologist in New York City, specializing in the Second Temple period. Klausner was not someone who usually worked with children. He was known for being strict, precise, entirely scientific. At first, he didn't take the request seriously, but when the family shared a few small details Joseph had described over the phone, his voice changed. How does he know this? He had asked in shock. All they could answer was, from our son's mouth. That alone was enough for Klausner to agree to come. The first meeting with Joseph. When Klausner arrived, Joseph appeared to be playing with his toys. But the moment the man walked in, the boy stopped, lifted his head, and looked at him for a long time. It was not the gaze of a child, but of someone much older. Klausner bent down and smiled. Hello, Joseph. I'm Amos. Joseph nodded quietly. Then he said something unexpected. You work at excavation sites. Klausner blinked in surprise. Yes. How did you know? Joseph answered calmly. From the dust on you." David and Miriam stared at each other. There was a faint trace of red soil on his trousers, the type of soil found only at a nearby excavation site outside New York. Klausner swallowed. "A keen observation, I suppose," he muttered, but deep inside he knew. This was more than observation. The tests begin. Dr. Klausner pulled several large sheets from his bag. Old maps, architectural plans, archaeological sketches, things that meant nothing to the average person. He placed them in front of Yosef. "What do these remind you of?" Yosef leaned toward one of them. It was a topographical drawing of first-century Jerusalem, detailed, intricate. The boy pointed to the upper left area. "I used to walk from here to the temple. In the mornings, it was crowded." Klausner's face tightened. Yosef's finger rested exactly on Decumanus Maximus, the ancient main road known through archaeological evidence. "And this area?" Klausner asked, pointing randomly. Yosef shook his head. "That wasn't there in my time." Klausner's eyes widened. The area Yosef dismissed was indeed part of a Roman expansion built long after the 1st century. The objects test. Next, Klausner opened photos of Roman-era objects on his tablet: an amphora, a denarius, an oil lamp. Joseph studied each image. "This one is for olive oil," he said, pointing at the amphora. "This coin would weigh like this," he added, miming the motion in his palm. "And this lamp. We used these at night. We had one at home." Klausner struggled to keep his composure. "Yosef, who taught you these things?" The boy shrugged. "No one taught me. I already knew." Klausner gave a nervous smile. "And how old were you then?" Without hesitation, Yosef answered, 31. The air in the room shifted. A 5-year-old child had just given the age of his own past life, naturally, effortlessly. Klausner's silence. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Klausner told the parents he would step outside to smoke. But in truth, he sat on the doorstep, holding his head in his hands, because a few minutes earlier, a 5-year-old boy had described details that even experts struggled to explain, details nearly impossible to know. Klausner whispered to himself, "This is impossible. And yet, it's true." After that first visit, Dr. Klausner no longer saw the case as mere curiosity. For nights he couldn't sleep. Yosef's words kept looping in his mind. Details no child could possibly memorize. And all of them offered freely, without prompting, without guidance. 1 week later, he returned. This time he came prepared. He brought a computer, old documents, maps, notes. But most importantly, he brought misleading material, details designed to look authentic, yet deliberately incorrect. If Yosef was inventing any of this, this would expose him. The moment the maps appeared, Yosef sat at the table. Without explanation, Klausner turned on the screen. "Just look," he said. "What do these remind you of?" 5 different maps of Jerusalem appeared, from different sources. Some were close to reality, others were intentionally flawed. One even included the borders of modern Jerusalem. Joseph stared at the screen. He stayed silent for a moment, then he slowly shook his head. "These are mixed up." Klausner froze his pen. "Which one is correct?" Joseph pointed to the third map. This one. But even this isn't complete. Why not? Because the northern wall is drawn wrong. It was shorter back then. Klausner held his breath. That detail existed only in specialist texts on the Second Temple period. Roads, gates, and errors. Klausner deliberately asked a wrong question. Did you enter the city through this gate? He pointed to what is now known as the Damascus Gate. Joseph frowned. No, that gate didn't exist. Are you sure? The child was firm. Yes, I used the Ephraim Gate when I went toward the villages to buy olives. Klausner closed his notebook. This was no coincidence anymore. A child was rejecting a gate that hadn't yet been built and naming the historically correct one instead. Describing the path he walked. Klausner opened a blank map on the screen. Show me how you walked from your home to the marketplace. Joseph stepped down from his chair. He stood up, as if he were no longer looking at a table but at the streets themselves. He traced a path in the air. I would leave from here. This was a narrow, dead-end street. Then I'd reach the stone road. Later, Klausner recreated that route digitally. The result was unsettling. The path aligned exactly with Decumanus Maximus, the question of smell. Klausner tried one final test, something children usually struggle with. What did the marketplace smell like? Joseph answered without hesitation. Old oil, burnt meat, and the soldiers. What kind of smell? Wet leather and metal. Klausner stood up from his chair. The description matched perfectly what historians knew about Roman legionnaires, the scent of leather armor and metal equipment. Klausner's note. When the meeting ended, Klausner wrote a single sentence in his notebook. This child does not know the past. He speaks as if he comes from it. From that moment on, this case was no longer personal curiosity. It was a scientific trial, and the next step would be far more disturbing.
Dr. Klausner knew they had reached a point of no return. The maps, the roads, the gates, the smells. Everything was far too consistent. And yet, there was still a boundary. In academia, everything could remain on paper until emotion entered the equation. The photograph. 1 week later, without offering any explanation, Klausner showed Joseph a single photograph. It was the stone steps leading down to the pool of Siloam, unearthed during excavations in 2005. Securely dated to the 1st century. The moment the image appeared on the screen, Joseph's face changed. His eyes widened. His breathing quickened. He pressed his hands against his knees. No, he whispered. I don't want this place. Miriam panicked. Joseph, what is it? But the child couldn't answer. His lips were trembling. Dr. Klausner tried to remain calm. You don't have to tell me anything, he said gently. You're just looking. But Joseph wasn't looking anymore. Remembered pain. Suddenly, Joseph began to cry. This was not like his previous tears. It was deeper, muted, suppressed. They brought badly wounded people here, he said in fragments. They would run. There was blood. So much blood. David moved toward his son, but Klausner raised his hand to stop him. Let him speak, he said, his voice shaking. This is important. Joseph closed his eyes. There was a man. His back was torn apart. Roman whips. The room went cold. Because historical records describe Roman scourging as using metal-tipped lashes that tore flesh apart. But Joseph wasn't reciting a sentence from a book. I gave him water, he said. He couldn't drink. On the third day, he died in my arms. At that point, Joseph began to tremble. Miriam nearly screamed. David lifted his son into his arms. The scientist breaks. Dr. Klausner stood frozen. With trembling hands, he removed his glasses. He whispered to himself, "These steps are dated to 33 AD. Joseph was still crying. It was cold there, he said. The stones were always cold. That detail, that sentence. The fact that the stone steps remained cold all day because they stayed in shadow was a technical detail documented in excavation reports. How could a child know that? The first breaking point. After this session, Joseph did not speak for 2 days. He didn't draw. He ate in silence. It was as if what he had remembered had deeply wounded him from within. Dr. Klausner finally said to the family, "I'm certain now. This child is not producing information. He is reliving memory." With that sentence, this was no longer just a family matter. It had become a case that concerned the world. And the next step required the involvement of a far greater name. After the events at the steps of Siloam, Dr. Klausner knew he could no longer handle this case on his own. This had gone far beyond the boundaries of classical archaeology. It was no longer just history that was being questioned. It was human consciousness itself. So he made a call. Professor Marco Benedetti, an academic who had spent more than 30 years studying reincarnation and past life memories in children. He was skeptical, rigid, not a man who used the word extraordinary lightly. Klausner kept the phone call short. "Professor Benedetti, I'm going to tell you there's an incredible child," he said, "but I'm not telling you a fairy tale." There was a brief silence. "If you're not telling me a fairy tale," Benedetti replied, "then I'll come." 1 week later, he arrived in New York. First impression. First words. When Benedetti met Joseph, the first thing he did was not speak. He sat down and observed the child. Joseph was playing with his toys, but not like an ordinary child, not scattered, not chaotic. Everything was orderly. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he had just entered his body and was measuring every action carefully. Benedetti wrote a single phrase in his notebook, incongruent maturity. Then he knelt down and spoke. "Hello, Joseph. I'm going to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Joseph nodded. "I know." That response, too, was noted. The first question, open-ended Benedetti's method, was simple. No leading questions, no guidance. "Can you tell me what you remember?" he asked. Joseph closed his eyes for a moment. Then he began to speak. "I lived near a marketplace. I had a small house with stone walls. In the mornings, the sun arrived late, because the street was very narrow." Benedetti struggled not to drop his pen. "And what year was it?" he asked. Joseph frowned. "We didn't count years. But the Romans, they called that year the Year of Simeon. That phrase appeared in Roman records corresponding to 33 AD, used as a colloquial reference of the time. The first time he saw Jesus, Benedetti remained silent. Joseph continued, "I saw him twice, speaking in the courtyard of the temple." "What was he saying?" the professor asked. Joseph answered, his tone changing. He told people not to be afraid, to forgive one another. This didn't sound like a sermon being quoted. It sounded like a memory. Political awareness. Benedetti tried something else. "Why were the Romans afraid of him?" Joseph replied without hesitation. "Because people loved him. The Romans were afraid when people loved someone." The professor lifted his head. This wasn't a child offering a naive opinion. It was an accurate summary of the logic of occupation in that era. The first decision. At the end of the 2-hour session, Benedetti closed his notebook. "This child," he said to Klausner, "is not memorizing facts. He isn't fantasizing." He took a deep breath. "This may be the most consistent past life case I have ever seen." Then he added, "And at the same time, the most dangerous." "Why?" David asked. "Because remembering this clearly," Benedetti replied, "is far too heavy for a child." The next step. Benedetti stood up. "If we are truly going to test this," he said, "we need to take him there." "There?" Miriam asked. The professor answered quietly, "To Jerusalem." When Benedetti said Jerusalem, the room fell into silence for a moment. That word stood at the center of everything Joseph had been describing for weeks, and at the center of the fear as well. Miriam was the first to react. "He's only 4 years old," she said. "Wouldn't this be too much for him to carry?" Benedetti nodded. "You're right. But understand this. If these memories are real, suppressing them can be just as traumatic as remembering them." David remained silent. He thought for a long time. Then he asked a single question. "If we go, will Joseph be safe?" Benedetti was honest. "No one can guarantee that." At that moment, Joseph spoke. He was looking at his mother. "Mom, I need to go there," he said. "I'll just look." That certainty. It wasn't the resolve of a child, but of an adult. The flight. On the plane, Joseph sat by the window. As the skies of New York disappeared below, he showed no excitement, no fear, no joy, as if this were a journey he had taken many times before. Miriam couldn't help herself. "Are you scared?" she asked. Joseph shook his head. "No, but my heart is beating fast." "Why?" "Because I can feel it as we get closer." That sentence made her heart tremble. First step onto the excavation site. In Jerusalem, their first stop was an active excavation site near the old city. The ground was open, stones exposed, dust, sunlight, silence. The moment Joseph stepped onto the site, he stopped. His feet froze in place, his hands clenched. "Here," he whispered. "I walked a lot in this area." The archaeologists exchanged glances. This site had only recently been excavated. It wasn't even open to the public yet. Dr. Klausner spoke carefully. "What do you see?" Joseph closed his eyes. Stalls, shouting, people. He took one step, then another. He stopped at a precise point. "Someone used to be here," he said, "making and selling pottery." Klausner and his team turned to the maps. Exactly where Josef was standing, a ceramic seal had been found weeks earlier, bearing a partially preserved name. Da, son of... It couldn't be fully read. A familiar ground. As Josef moved through the excavation, he never wandered randomly. He avoided some areas completely and paused deliberately at others. He knelt in front of a stone surface. "I used to hide money here." Klausner flinched. "Are you sure?" Josef nodded. "Yes, so the Romans wouldn't take it." The excavation team hesitated, then carefully opened the spot. At a depth of roughly 25 centimeters, a small cavity appeared. Inside were 3 Roman denarii. Silence fell. This had gone beyond scientific doubt. The moment Benedetti froze, Professor Benedetti stepped back. He was struggling to breathe. "Record everything," he said quietly. "Every second." In all his years as an academic, he had never witnessed anything like this. A child pointing to a hiding place from his own past life. Joseph, meanwhile, looked tired. "Can we take a break?" he asked. It was the most ordinary sentence a child could say, but what had just happened was anything but ordinary. The 3 coins at the excavation site left a silence hanging in the air. No one spoke out loud anymore. It felt as if everyone sensed that a single wrong word could push them somewhere from which there was no return. Joseph sat down in the shade, but his eyes were far away. Benedetti approached him. "If you want, we can stop for today," he said. "You've done enough." Joseph looked up. "There's something else," he said calmly. That sentence tightened everyone's chest. What wasn't meant to be said? "I need to see the eastern side of the excavation," Joseph said. "You haven't opened it yet." Klausner frowned. "That area hasn't been worked on." Joseph didn't hesitate. "But there's a house there." "What kind of house?" Benedetti asked. Josef's voice dropped. "My house." Klausner closed his notebook. This was no longer a casual statement. The moment the names appeared. When they reached the eastern section, Josef slowed down. He stopped at one point and placed his hand on the ground. "I hid them here," he said. Miriam felt her heart stop. "Who?" she asked. Joseph lifted his head. "The young man and the woman." A brief pause. Then, with unmistakable clarity, he said, "The mother of Yeshua and the disciple he loved." The words seemed to echo across the site. Klausner whispered involuntarily, "Mary and John." Joseph nodded. 2 days. 2 days? Benedetti asked. "They stayed in my house for 2 days." The days in the house. Benedetti knelt down. "Do you want to tell us about it?" Joseph closed his eyes. His voice changed, deeper, heavier. "The woman didn't speak," he said. "She cried constantly, silently." "And the young man?" "He never left her side. He brought her water. He never lowered his head." Joseph swallowed. After losing him, no mother should ever have to grieve that deeply. That sentence was not something a child could invent. Where science falls, Silent Benedetti stood up. "We need to open this area," he said to Klausner. Klausner shook his head slowly. "That would mean playing with history." "Maybe," Benedetti replied, "but history is already speaking to us." Another fear. That night at the hotel, Joseph had his first nightmare. He woke up screaming. "They didn't come back," he kept saying. "They left the city. At night." Miriam held him tightly. "Who?" she asked. "Them," Joseph said. "I never saw them again." It matched the story he had been telling all along. Mary and John must have left Jerusalem in secret. Yet these were details, not even described this clearly in the Gospels. The decision of the next day. The next morning, Benedetti spoke a single sentence. "This area must be excavated." Klausner closed his eyes. "If we find something." "Yes," Benedetti said. "If we do, there's no turning back." Joseph stood quietly by the window. Then he said only this: "There is something there. They will believe us." The next morning, as they headed to the excavation site, no one spoke much. It felt as if everyone sensed that by the end of the day, nothing would ever be the same again. Joseph was quiet, but this silence wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Work began in the eastern section before the sun had fully risen. The archaeologists moved with their usual precision, layer by layer, patiently, millimeter by millimeter. Joseph stood at the edge of the site. He didn't touch anything. He didn't guide anyone. He didn't shout. He only watched. A little lower. After about an hour, Joseph took a step forward. Klausner turned instinctively. "A little more," Joseph said. "Underneath." The team at the pit hesitated. Klausner paused, then asked, out of academic reflex, "What's underneath, Joseph?" The child lowered his head slightly. "A memory." That single word made everyone hold their breath. The excavation continued. Moments later, the tool struck not metal, but ceramic. The first piece. The soil was cleared carefully. A small oil lamp emerged, unbroken, plain, unadorned, yet intact. One archaeologist whispered, "First century." But the real shock was still to come. On the side of the lamp, there was a faint inscription, difficult to read, as if etched long ago. Everyone looked at one another. Klausner could barely speak. "Clean it." The name. As the inscription became clear, the excavation site fell into complete silence. It was written in Aramaic letters. Eleazar ben Shimon, protector of the persecuted. Miriam's knees gave way. David forgot how to breathe. Joseph did nothing. He simply looked on. Benedetti whispered, "This isn't possible." Silent confirmation. Klausner turned to Joseph. That's the name you've been saying." Joseph nodded. "Yes, my lamp." A child, holding an object that had belonged to a man who lived 2,000 years ago, was saying, "This is mine, not to claim it, but to remember it." The collapse of the scientists. Epigraphy experts were called in. The engraving style, the period, the letter forms. Everything was correct. The lamp was authentic. The inscription was not added later. The soil layer was undisturbed. This could not have been staged. Joseph's sentence. While everyone focused on the details, Joseph spoke quietly. I used it to give them light. Benedetti flinched. To whom? To the ones who stayed in my house, Joseph said, when they cried at night. That sentence broke everyone present. One archaeologist was crying. Another held his head in his hands. Because at this point, this was no longer about proof. At this point, the truth was this. History was speaking through the voice of a child. After the discovery of the lamp, the excavation site was no longer an ordinary archaeological field. Security was increased. Camera crews were kept away. Every finding was documented, quietly and with extreme care. That day, Joseph was unusually calm. It felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Benedetti noticed. Did you remember something? He asked gently. Joseph nodded. The ending. The hollow inside the wall. As the excavation progressed, a strange hollow was discovered within the eastern wall of the structure believed to be Elias's home. It wasn't a natural crack. It had been deliberately sealed. Klausner paused. This was sealed on purpose. Joseph looked at the wall, then stepped back. I shouldn't look there, he said. Why not? Because it was something I gave. That sentence made the team's hearts race. The scroll. The wall was opened with great care. Inside, fragments of parchment, preserved against time, were retrieved. The epigraphy expert whispered, Torah. The scrolls were fragmented, yet astonishingly preserved. The dryness had slowed time itself. Joseph did not approach. I hid it there, he said, because it was sacred. Who did it belong to? Benedetti asked. It wasn't mine, Joseph replied, but it didn't belong to them either. It was in my house. I had to give it. The white lily. Among the parchment layers, a different texture appeared, mixed with soil. The botanist leaned closer. This is plant residue. It was removed with extreme caution, a small, dried flower. The experts looked at one another. It's a lily, a white lily. Joseph closed his eyes. The final memory. She gave this to me, he said softly, when they were leaving. Who? Miriam asked. The woman, Joseph replied, to say thank you. Tears streamed down Miriam's face. Joseph continued. I hid it because to me, this meant hope. Scientific shock carbon-14 tests were conducted. When the results arrived, no one could speak. 33 AD, plus or minus a few years. The lily residue dated precisely to that period, and in Jerusalem, during that era, the white lily symbolized mourning and hope. Benedetti's note. That night, Benedetti wrote in his notebook, from this point on, calling this case a claim is impossible. This is a convergence of memory and matter. Joseph's final sentence. As they were leaving the excavation site, Joseph turned back. He looked at the wall. I kept my promise, he said. Now, it has been kept. What was found at the excavation site was supposed to remain confidential. At least, that was the plan. But something like this could never stay hidden for long. One of the people involved in the excavation sent a single photograph, the lamp, the inscription, and the message attached to it was simple. This can't be normal. Within hours, the image began to circulate, from one academic to another, then to a journalist, then to an editor. And after that, there was no turning back. The first article. 3 days later, a short piece appeared in a small cultural magazine. Unusual findings belonging to an unidentified first-century Jewish merchant at an excavation in Jerusalem. There was no name, no mention of a child, but the details were far too familiar. When Klausner saw the article, he slammed his fist on the table. "We're not ready for this," he said. "Yosef isn't ready." But the media never waits. The phones begin to ring first, the academic circles called, then journalists, then television networks. Benedetti's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Is this a hoax? Is this reincarnation? Is this a miracle? To every question, Benedetti gave the same answer. "We can't speak yet." But there was a child involved, and the world is never gentle with children. The impact on Yosef noticed. One evening, while the television was on in the hotel room, he stared at the screen. Images of Jerusalem were playing. "They're talking about me," he said. Miriam panicked. "No," she said quickly. "Not you." Yosef looked away. "Me," he repeated, "because I remember." From that night on, the nightmares returned. This time they were harsher. There was no cross, no soldiers. But there was a crowd. Shouting voices, lights, questions, scientific pressure. Within a week, 3 universities demanded official statements. 2 archaeology institutes requested to join the excavation. A private foundation offered an independent review. And everyone asked the same question: when can we see the child? That question infuriated Benedetti. "This is not a lab subject," he said. "This is a child." A rift within the family. For the first time, David and Miriam disagreed. David wanted to speak publicly. "If we don't tell the story," he said, "others will. At least this way, we stay in control." Miriam cried. "Yosef can't handle this," she said. "He's already carrying 2 lives." That sentence. It hung in the room for a long time that night. The last news. Joseph heard the next day. Benedetti ended a phone call and spoke slowly. The Vatican called. The room went cold. "What do they want?" Miriam asked. Benedetti answered briefly. "A meeting." Joseph's reaction. Joseph was standing by the window. "Tell them," he said, "I didn't bring a message from God." Benedetti froze. "Then what did you bring?" he asked. Joseph turned around. "Memory," he said, "and pain. Nothing else." The request from the Vatican was brief, precise, and formal. "We request a meeting." There was no press involved, no cameras, no public statement, only a name. Monsignor Antonio Ferrara, a clergyman at the Vatican known for examining extraordinary cases and for believing in very little. Throughout his career, he had reviewed and closed hundreds of files, rarely declaring any of them extraordinary. When Benedetti read the file, A single thought crossed his mind. If this man is convinced, everyone else will fall silent. The arrival Ferrara arrived in Jerusalem quietly. A black cassock, no curiosity on his face, no excitement, only fatigue. The meeting with Joseph took place in a small room. There was no cross on the wall, no icon, just a table, 3 chairs. Ferrara sat down, bringing himself level with Joseph. He looked directly into the boy's eyes. The gaze lasted a long time. Then he spoke. "You don't need to be afraid of me." Joseph nodded. "I know." That answer alone was enough to make Ferrara raise an eyebrow. The questioning begins. "You don't have to tell me anything," Ferrara said. "If you want, we can simply sit in silence." Joseph thought for a moment. "Silence wouldn't help," he said. "It's harder." Ferrara did not open a notebook. He simply listened. "Tell me about the woman," he said. "The woman you said you hid." Joseph didn't hesitate. "She was very tired," he said, her eyes, as if they had seen everything. "Did she smile?" Ferrara asked. Joseph shook his head. "No, but there was one moment when she did." Ferrara's voice softened. "When?" "In the morning," Joseph said. "On the 3rd day." Theological test. Ferrara didn't stop there. He asked a difficult question. "What did Jesus say to you?" The question was deliberate. A child's imagination would collapse here. Joseph remained silent for a long time. Then he lifted his head. "He didn't speak to me," he said. Ferrara froze. "What do you mean?" "I was in the kitchen. The door was slightly open. They were speaking quietly." That detail was spatial, natural, unrehearsed, the wrong. Question. Ferrara made a deliberate mistake. "Did you think he was God?" Joseph looked at him sharply. "No." "What do you mean?" "We didn't see him as God, but as someone close to God." That answer was a purely first-century Jewish perspective, not modern Christian language. Ferrara held his breath. The heavy question. The final question came. "Who are you, Joseph?" The room grew quiet. Joseph looked down. "I am Joseph," he said, "and I am Ilyasa." "Both at the same time?" "Yes." Ferrara opened his notebook for the first time. He wrote a single line. "This child is not performing. He carries 2 identities." The end of the interrogation. When the meeting ended, Ferrara stood up and leaned toward Joseph. "People are expecting a miracle from you," he said. "Are you ready for that?" Joseph looked up. "I am not a miracle," he said. "I remember." Ferrara's confidential report. That night, a single-page report was sent to the Vatican. It contained one sentence. "I can neither declare this case sacred nor dismiss it, but I can say this. This child is not lying." After Monsignor Ferrara's report, no one wanted to speak out loud anymore. It felt as if a threshold had been crossed. Every word spoken now carried a weight that could never be taken back. Still, Ferrara wanted to do one last thing. Quietly, away from the public eye, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For the Christian world, the place of the crucifixion and the tomb. "We don't have to go," Ferrara told the family. "This is only for me." Joseph lifted his head. "I'll come," he said. but his voice no longer carried the certainty it once had. As they drew closer, when the stone walls of the church appeared in the distance, Joseph's pace slowed. His steps became uneven. Miriam took her son's hand. "Your fingers are ice cold," she said. Joseph swallowed. "I don't like this place." Ferrara stopped. "Why?" Joseph lowered his head. "Because it's too crowded." Ferrara was surprised. "Now." "No," Joseph said. "Before. The threshold." When they reached the church doors, Joseph stopped. He couldn't go inside. His breathing quickened. His palms were damp. "I can't enter," he said. Ferrara knelt down. "What do you see?" Joseph closed his eyes. "It smells," he said. "Blood, sweat, and fear." That description matched historical accounts of Roman execution sites with disturbing precision. The collapse. He took one step, then another. On the second step, his knees gave way. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply collapsed. "They were there," he whispered. "The nails. They were very loud." Miriam began to cry. David lifted the child into his arms, but Joseph was trembling. "The stones were angry," he said. "The sun was too bright." Ferrara stepped back. This wasn't a panic attack. This was the reliving of trauma. Medical confirmation. 2 psychologists were called in. Both said the same thing. "This reaction is not fabricated." One of them added, "This child is not recalling a memory. He is re-experiencing an event." Ferrara's decision. As they left the church, Ferrara stopped. Without turning back, he said, "From this point on, no one should bring this child near sacred symbols." Then he added, "This is not a test of faith. It is a human limit." What Yosef Said. That night, Yosef developed a fever. When he woke up, he said only one sentence: "I shouldn't have looked at the stones." Miriam asked through tears, "Which ones?" Yosef closed his eyes. "The bloody ones." The collapse at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre changed the way everyone approached Yosef. This was no longer about an extraordinary case. It was about Joseph's mental health. Benedetti was the first to recognize it. "If this continues, he will break," he said. Remembering and living are not the same thing. Dark circles had formed under Joseph's eyes. His face had grown pale. Since arriving in Jerusalem, many doors had been opened, but every door brought a new burden. A child psychiatrist steps in. From New York Presby Hospital, trauma specialist Dr. Elias Berman was called to Jerusalem. His first sentence was clear. This child's past may be debatable, but his suffering is not. According to Berman, Joseph's condition could fall into one of 3 possibilities: early trauma activation caused by extreme stress, identity dissociation, a very rare condition, episodic memory access of unknown origin. For the third category, Berman added a special note: episodic memories whose source cannot be scientifically explained. It was a classification rarely used, but sometimes unavoidable. The first session. Yosef sat on a mat. In his hand, he was holding a small stone, perhaps because his memories felt like stone. Berman spoke gently. "What do you feel right now?" Joseph lowered his head. Tired. What kind of tired? Like I'm two people, Joseph said. Both are me, but they're not the same. Berman took notes. These were signs of dissociation, but Joseph was expressing them with the words of a 4-year-old child. Nightmares. Joseph began waking frequently at night, not in fear, but under a heavy physical weight. In his sleep, he whispered words. Stone. Stairs. The third day. Miriam was reaching her limit. How can a child carry this much pain? She asked. Berman answered, the pain is encoded in his mind as memory. This isn't an ordinary dream or fear. This is lived experience. Brain scan results. A low-stress functional MRI scan was performed on Joseph. The results were startling. The amygdala, responsible for emotional memory, was hyperactive for his age. The hippocampus, where long-term memories are processed, resembled that of adults carrying traumatic memory. Yet the language center appeared to be attempting adult-like sentence construction. Berman added this line to his report. This child carries the neurological traces of a trauma that does not belong to his own life. Benedetti's reflection. When Benedetti saw the results, he collapsed into a chair. He never wanted this, he said. Joseph only remembered. Dr. Klausner added something deeper. Perhaps remembering wasn't his choice. Perhaps forgetting was never an option. That sentence lingered in everyone's mind. Joseph's confession. After one session, Joseph asked quietly, did I do something bad? Berman was startled. Why would you think that? Joseph looked away. Because everyone is afraid because of me. Those words were the words of a child carrying the weight of the world. Miriam pulled her son into her arms. No one is afraid of you, my love. They're just trying to understand. Joseph whispered, so am I. Therapies had begun for Joseph, but the world did not slow down. On the contrary, the world was accelerating toward this story. The discoveries in Jerusalem had grown too large to be kept behind closed doors. Archaeological evidence, neurological reports, psychological evaluations. When all of it was placed side by side, only one question remained. How do we explain this to the world? The moment of decision. Benedetti, Klausner, and Ferrara gathered in a small room. There were no holy books on the table, no academic journals, only files. If we stay silent, Klausner began. Ferrara nodded quietly. And if we speak, Klausner continued, we place faith and science into the same fire. Benedetti took a deep breath. Then, he said, we do this the only way science knows how. Transparent, controlled, and without placing Joseph at the center. That sentence became the decision. The conference. On October 31st, an international scientific conference was held in Jerusalem. The invitation list was anything but ordinary. Archaeologists, historians, neuroscientists, child psychologists, scholars of religion, philosophers. But one person was absent, Joseph. This had been decided deliberately. The presentations. Dr. Klausner presented the archaeological findings, the coins, the lamp, the parchments, the lily. Each item had been verified by independent laboratories. Benedetti presented the psychological data. Over 100 hours of interviews. No leading questions, no inconsistencies. Dr. Berman presented the neurological findings. This child, he said, carries the traces of a trauma he did not experience in this life. No one spoke in the hall. The world press. The next day, headlines appeared across the globe. Science confronts history. A child's memory span. 2,000 years. Is this reincarnation? But Joseph's name was not mentioned. His face was not shown. His location was not disclosed. That was the family's request. Reactions. The world split in two. Some called it proof of faith. Others called it collective consciousness. Some accused science of blindness. But the most striking reaction came from those who remained silent. Because in private correspondence, some scientists were writing, "We cannot explain this, and that, too, is data." Joseph at home. On the day of the conference, Joseph was in Berlin, sitting on his bed, playing with his Lego bricks. Miriam sat beside him. "The whole world is talking," she said, "but you don't have to." Joseph looked up. "I know." "And what do you think?" she asked. Joseph snapped one brick onto another. "They didn't need to listen to me," he said. "I needed to remember." The final line. That evening, Benedetti wrote Joseph a letter, a short note. Remembering does not define you. Living does. Joseph read the letter, then turned to his mother. "I'm here now," he said, "and I'm staying." After the conference, the world kept talking about Joseph. But Joseph remained silent. Life in Berlin slowed down. There was no noise, no cameras, no questions. Only the sounds of home. Returning, Joseph grew accustomed to his room again. Children's drawings still hung on the walls. Cars, animals, the sky. But on one corner of his desk, there was a small, unassuming picture. A stone road, a narrow street. No one asked him to remove it. Joseph never asked about it either. As the memories fade. As therapy continued, Joseph's stories became less frequent. He no longer spoke about Jerusalem every day. Sometimes weeks would pass. Berman wrote in his notes, "The memories are not retreating. They are becoming quiet." This mattered, because this was not repression. It was acceptance. One more question. One day Joseph asked his mother, "Did Ilyasa die?" Miriam paused. That question was very big. "Yes," she said finally, "like everyone else." Joseph nodded. "Good," he said. "Then I'm here." That sentence became a turning point in therapy. The dreams change. The nightmares stopped, but dreams continued. There were no soldiers, no cross, only light. Berman explained the change this way. It appears the traumatic memories have been processed. The brain is no longer in defense mode. Benedetti's acceptance. One day Benedetti said to Joseph, "Perhaps we will never fully explain this." Joseph shrugged. "That's okay," he said. "Not everything needs an explanation." That sentence shook Benedetti. In 30 years of academic work, it was the simplest and the deepest answer he had ever received. The function of time months passed. Joseph ran, laughed, fell, cried, and played like any 6-year-old child. But sometimes, in the middle of play, he would stop, look out the window, and grow quiet. No one asked why. That too was part of the therapy. What the father noticed one evening, as David watched his son, he said, "The past is no longer speaking. It's listening." The sentence settled into the room. Joseph's final reminder. One day, Joseph spoke on his own. "My task was to remember." "It's finished," Miriam asked through tears. "Are you sure?" Joseph smiled. "Yes." Years later, those who spoke about Joseph's story always paused at the same points: the evidence, history, science, faith. But Joseph never lingered on any of them. He grew up, finished school, made friends, fell down, got back up, laughed, and sometimes, very rarely, something happened. Quiet moments. Joseph would drift off while looking out the window. If someone was nearby, they would notice. "What are you thinking about?" they'd ask. Joseph wouldn't answer right away. Then he would say something very simple. "I remembered something." But there were no details anymore. No places, no names, only feeling. Where science arrived. Years later, Dr. Klausner wrote in an article, "This case reminded us less of what we do not know and more of the limits of what we think we know." Benedetti closed his conference notes with this sentence: "Perhaps consciousness extends across time far more widely than we assume." Ferrara wrote nothing. He only said, "Witness does not always require explanation." One last finding. Years later in Jerusalem, a small stone fragment from the structure identified as Elias's home was placed in a museum. There was a marking on it, simple, carved, a lily. No one offered an interpretation. Joseph's sentence. One evening, Joseph asked his mother, "Mom, why do people want to know everything?" Miriam smiled, "Because knowing helps us not be afraid." Joseph nodded. "But remembering," he said, "is sometimes the fear itself." And the question. Those who read this story still ask, was this reincarnation, collective consciousness, a chain of trauma, a miracle? But Joseph never asked. He remembered. Then he lived. And in the end, only one question remained. If a child can carry the pain of 2,000 years ago, how close are we today to remembering each other's pain?